Ever wondered how medieval peasants baked fresh bread without modern ovens? Using only mud, straw, and stones from their fields, they built cooking machines that fed entire families for generations. These DIY survival techniques could still save lives today. Bread crisis. Medieval peasants faced a deadly problem that could kill entire families. They had grain but couldn't turn it into edible food without proper baking equipment. Bread formed 70% of the medieval diet, yet most villages had zero commercial bakeries or cooking facilities available to common people. Raw grain was completely inedible and often dangerous. Eating uncooked wheat could cause severe digestive problems that led to malnutrition and death during harsh winters when medical care didn't exist. Without ovens, families literally starved while surrounded by abundant grain harvests. Lord's control. Building your own oven wasn't just difficult, it was illegal and could mean execution for defying feudal authority that controlled every aspect of peasant survival. Feudal lords maintained strict monopolies over all baking facilities, forcing peasants to pay crushing oven taxes that consumed up to 20% of their grain harvests just for the privilege of making bread. These mandatory fees enriched nobles while keeping peasant families perpetually hungry and financially desperate. Villages were required to use only their lord's official ovens, often located miles away from homes, meaning families walked hours carrying heavy grain sacks just to bake basic survival food. Secret home ovens represented dangerous rebellion against the feudal system that could result in severe punishment, property confiscation, or death sentences for entire families caught violating these oppressive monopoly laws. Finding materials. Smart peasants learned to identify materials that could withstand extreme heat without exploding or crumbling. Knowledge that separated successful oven builders from those whose families went hungry all winter long. River clay proved superior to regular dirt because flowing water removed impurities and created smooth, dense material that bonded properly under high temperatures. Peasants developed simple tests for clay quality. Good clay held together when squeezed wet, didn't crack when dried, and felt smooth rather than gritty between fingers. Finding proper stones required expertise, ESPS. Some rocks exploded violently when heated, killing anyone nearby and destroying months of construction work. Safe stones were dense, had no visible cracks, and produced clear ringing sounds when struck with metal tools. Straw wasn't just filler but functioned as medieval rebar, creating internal reinforcement that prevented clay from cracking during the heating and cooling cycles that destroyed inferior ovens. But clay alone wasn't enough to create ovens that could survive brutal medieval winters and feed desperate families. Building foundation. The foundation determined whether ovens lasted decades or collapsed within months, making this stage crucial for family survival during harsh seasons when oven failure meant starvation. Stone foundations prevented deadly moisture damage that caused clay ovens to crumble from groundwater absorption that weakened structural integrity over time. Proper drainage systems channeled rainwater away from oven bases, preventing the saturated soil conditions that caused catastrophic foundation failures during spring thaw periods. Insulation layers using sand and ash created thermal barriers that retained heat longer while protecting foundations from extreme temperature fluctuations that cracked poorly insulated ovens. Level surfaces were critical for even baking minus. Tilted ovens created hot and cold spots that burned some bread while leaving other loaves dangerously undercooked and inedible. Size calculations required mathematical precision. Family size determined oven dimensions because ovens too small couldn't feed everyone while oversized ovens wasted precious fuel that took days to collect. Location selection considered wind protection and fire safety, as poorly positioned ovens caught house fires that destroyed entire family shelters. One mistake here destroyed months of backbreaking work and condemned families to another winter without reliable bread baking capabilities. Dome magic. The dome construction stage killed more ovens than fire ever did, requiring techniques that peasants learned through dangerous trial and error experimentation that often resulted in total construction failures. Sandform technique involved building temporary sand mounds that provided perfect dome shapes, then carefully removing sand after clay hardened to create hollow baking chambers with optimal heat circulation patterns. Clay-straw mixture ratios were critical secrets that peasants discovered through generations of experimentation. Too much clay created brittle surfaces that cracked, while excessive straw made weak walls that couldn't withstand baking temperatures. Thickness requirements demanded precision. Walls too thin developed dangerous cracks that let heat escape and caused uneven baking, while walls too thick never heated properly and wasted enormous amounts of fuel that families couldn't afford to burn. Door size followed specific mathematical formulas that peasants learned by observing successful ovens. Doors needed to be exactly 63% of dome height to create proper airflow that maintained even temperatures throughout the baking chamber. Chimney placement required understanding smoke flow principles that most peasants learned through bitter experience with smoky failures that made bread taste terrible and filled homes with dangerous fumes. The drying process was equally treacherous. Rushing caused structural collapse, while too slow drying encouraged mold growth that ruined entire construction projects and forced families to start over from scratch. First fire. The first firing represented the most dangerous moment in oven construction, when months of careful work either succeeded brilliantly or exploded catastrophically, destroying families' hopes for winter bread security. Gradual heating schedules prevented thermal shock that caused instant oven destruction. Peasants learned to build tiny fires initially, slowly increasing heat over several days until clay reached maximum temperature without cracking. Signs of successful firing versus failure were subtle but crucial. Successful ovens turned white-hot uniformly, while failed ovens showed dark spots indicating incomplete heating that would cause future structural problems. Steam vents prevented deadly explosions by allowing moisture trapped in clay to escape slowly rather than building dangerous pressure that could kill anyone standing nearby during firing processes. Clay color changes indicated internal temperature levels. Gray meant insufficient heat, white showed proper firing, while yellow warned of dangerous overheating that could cause complete oven destruction. Crack repair techniques using fresh clay could save partially damaged ovens, but required immediate action before cracks widened into total structural failures that couldn't be repaired. Temperature testing without modern thermometers required peasants to judge heat levels using visual cues, sound changes, and even dangerous hand proximity tests that sometimes caused severe burns. Safety measures were primitive but essential because house fires from poorly managed ovens destroyed entire family shelters and left people homeless during brutal winters. Many families lost everything during first firing attempts when inexperience led to catastrophic accidents that eliminated months of construction work and condemned them to another year of dangerous dependence on their lords. Expensive monopoly ovens. Baking mastery. Heat retention principles that peasants mastered through necessity created baking systems that could feed families for weeks using single firing sessions that maximized fuel efficiency during wood-scarce periods. Bread loading order followed specific patterns learned through generations of experience. Largest loaves went in first when temperatures peaked, followed by smaller items as heat gradually decreased to prevent burning while ensuring thorough cooking. Steam injection using wet rags placed inside ovens created perfect crusts that sealed in moisture and prevented bread from drying into inedible rocks that wasted precious grain resources families couldn't afford to lose. Temperature zones within single ovens allowed simultaneous baking of different food types, hottest areas near fires, cooked meat, while cooler sections handled delicate pastries and bread that required lower temperatures. Timing without modern clocks required peasants to judge doneness using bread color changes, crust sounds when tapped, and distinctive aromas that indicated perfect completion versus dangerous undercooking that could cause illness. Multiple baking sessions from single heating maximized efficiency as peasants used residual heat for secondary cooking projects like drying fruits, roasting nuts, and preparing medicinal herbs that provided additional nutrition during lean winter months. Ash removal and oven cleaning methods preserved baking quality while preventing contamination that could ruin entire bread batches and waste irreplaceable grain supplies during critical survival periods. One firing could feed a family for weeks if managed properly, making oven mastery literally a matter of life and death for medieval peasant survival. Village ovens. Shared community ovens reduced individual construction risks while creating social centers that strengthened village bonds through cooperative bread baking that brought isolated families together regularly. Baking schedules required complex neighborly cooperation as families negotiated time slots, shared fuel costs, and coordinated cooking projects that maximized oven efficiency while minimizing conflicts over access to critical survival resources. Teaching oven skills across generations ensured knowledge preservation as experienced builders trained younger villagers in construction techniques, maintenance procedures, and baking methods that sustained communities through harsh periods when food security determined survival. Seasonal baking patterns created village rhythms around harvest time rushes when grain abundance required intensive processing to create preserved bread supplies that lasted through winter months of scarcity and hunger. Social aspects transformed utilitarian ovens into community, gathering places where villagers shared gossip, arranged marriages, exchanged news from distant places, and maintained social connections that prevented isolation during long winter confinements. Conflict resolution over oven time and repair responsibilities required diplomatic skills as neighbors balanced individual needs with community welfare, while managing disputes that could destroy vital cooperation necessary for everyone's survival. Protection from Lord's soldiers during inspections demanded community solidarity as villagers concealed illegal ovens through coordinated deception that protected families from severe punishments for violating feudal monopoly. Laws. Ovens built more than bread. They built communities that could survive medieval hardships through mutual support and shared resources that individual families couldn't maintain alone. Survival tool. Medieval ovens served as multi-purpose survival tools that went far beyond bread baking to provide heating, food preservation, and emergency shelter capabilities that meant life or death during brutal winter conditions. Bread baking in freezing temperatures required special techniques, as peasants learned to maintain oven heat despite snow, ice, and bitter winds that could extinguish fires and destroy carefully planned baking sessions that families desperately needed for survival. Drying grains and preserving foods extended harvest abundance throughout lean winter months, when fresh food disappeared and preserved supplies determined whether families lived or starved before spring brought new growing seasons. Heating homes during brutal winters utilized residual oven heat that warmed family shelters for hours after baking completed, providing crucial thermal comfort that prevented hypothermia deaths in poorly insulated medieval houses. Cooking stews and roasting meats maximized nutrition from available protein sources while making tough medieval meat edible through slow cooking techniques that broke down fibers and created digestible meals from otherwise inedible animal parts. Drying clothes and medicinal herbs provided essential services that maintained family health through proper hygiene and herbal medicine preparation that treated illnesses when professional medical care was unavailable or unaffordable. Emergency shelter heat sources could save lives during unexpected cold snaps when normal heating systems failed and families faced immediate death from exposure to killing temperatures. Fuel efficiency addressed wood scarcity problems, as peasants learned to maximize heat output from limited fuel supplies gathered through backbreaking labor that consumed entire days of precious time and energy. Maintenance during harsh weather required protective techniques that kept ovens functional through storms, floods, and temperature extremes that could destroy unprotected construction and leave families without cooking capabilities when they most needed them. When ovens failed, families froze and starved as they lost their primary cooking, heating, and food preservation system during seasons when these capabilities determined survival versus death.
Today, I'm sharing 12 genius medieval bread methods that beat modern baking. Hot stone baking. Peasants placed dough under upturned pots on the down hearth. Flat stones in the center of their huts where fires burned. The embers kept stones hot for hours, creating perfect baking conditions. This method required no expensive oven construction while providing consistent heat distribution. Some stones stayed hot enough to bake bread for the entire day after single firing. Modern electric ovens can't match this energy efficiency, but this was just the beginning of a medieval baking genius. Ash baking. Bread was cooked directly in ashes of fires, as long as you turned it often. This worked perfectly. Medieval people wrapped dough in leaves or cloth before burying it in hot ashes. This technique created crusty exteriors while keeping interiors moist and perfectly cooked. The ash acted like natural insulation, maintaining a steady temperature throughout the baking process. Archaeological evidence shows charred bread remains in medieval fire pits across Europe. Some peasants specialized in ash baking, becoming village bread experts. Modern camping enthusiasts still use these techniques today. Yet medieval people discovered even more sophisticated methods. Pan-fried flatbread. Sphinx and Anglo-Saxons cooked flatbreads on iron skillets over open fires. Archaeological discoveries at Winchester in York show flat skillet-type pans throughout the Viking world. Flatbreads took only a couple minutes each side, providing quick, nutritious meals without ovens. These pans were designed with specific thickness to distribute heat evenly without burning. Medieval blacksmiths created specialized bread cooking vessels that modern manufacturers still copy today. The technique was so effective that travelers could make fresh bread anywhere with just a portable pan and fire. Some skillets were passed down through generations as valuable family heirlooms. Norse explorers used this method during long voyages across unknown seas. Modern non-stick pans pale in comparison to medieval iron craftsmanship. However, the most revolutionary discovery was about yeast itself. Natural fermentation. Medieval people used yeast from brewing beer, either from batch brewing in-house or neighbor's batch. Natural wild yeast present in flour and environment initiated fermentation when mixed with water. Visible, chalky film of yeast on fruit skins started fermentation, like grapes, into flour mixtures. Medieval bakers dropped unwashed fruits. This process required no commercial yeast purchases, making bread accessible to poorest families. Active cultures year-round. Some villages had designated yeast keepers whose job was maintaining. Monastery brewing operations became centers of yeast cultivation knowledge. The fermentation process took 2 to 3 days but created bread with superior flavor and nutrition compared to quick-rise modern loaves. Medieval people understood bacterial cultures centuries before science explained the process. Apple skins, grape surfaces, this knowledge meant survival during harsh winters when other food sources failed. Provided consistent yeast sources, and berry boiled. Yet creating flour itself required incredible ingenuity. Hand-ground flour. Power peasants ground grain by hand in wooden mortar or stone troughs. Small hand-turned corn stones throughout the early medieval world showed grinding flour was a daily routine. This fresh ground flour contains natural oils, grinding process, and yeasts that store-bought flour lacks, creating better fermentation and flavor. The process was laborious but essential. Families often worked together, rotating the heavy stone mills. Medieval millers understood different grinding techniques for various grains, adjusting pressure and speed for optimal results. Daily bread-making routines. Some households owned portable quarries for traveling, ensuring fresh flour anywhere. Wealthy monasteries invested in water-powered mills, but most peasants relied on human-powered grinding. This daily ritual connected families to their food source in ways modern people can't imagine. Quality of grinding stones determined village prosperity and survival rates. But when flour wasn't available, medieval people had backup plans. Unleavened survival bread. Peasants mixed grain with water to bake unleavened bread or oatcakes when yeast wasn't available. Unleavened flatbread remained common in northern regions where wheat was difficult to grow. Community oven sharing. Peasants brought dough to village bakers or shared ovens when individual homes lacked ovens. Medieval ovens were built outside towns due to fire risk, creating community baking systems. This sharing reduced costs while ensuring everyone had access to proper bread. Village ovens were massive stone constructions that could bake dozens of loaves simultaneously. The oven keeper was a respected community member who controlled baking schedules and temperatures. Families would mark their loaves with distinctive patterns to identify them after communal baking. The system created social bonds as neighbors gathered during baking days to share news and gossip. Wealthy households sometimes owned private ovens and charged neighbors for usage, creating small businesses. Monastery ovens served surrounding communities, spreading religious influence through daily bread provision. The economics worked because shared costs made expensive oven construction affordable for entire villages. Baking schedules were strictly organized. Bread first when ovens were hottest, then pastries, finally slow-cooking stews. Some communities built seasonal outdoor ovens for harvest celebrations and festivals. The communal system ensured no family went without bread, creating medieval social safety nets. Village oven disputes sometimes required legal arbitration, showing their critical importance. Yet individual families developed private solutions to